passing of a bill aimed at punishing unpatriotic acts in Zimbabwe has seen President Emmerson Mnangagwa and the ruling Zanu-PF receive severe criticism from opposition political parties. Now, this bill comes ahead of the general election set for the 23rd of August. Opposition parties have slammed the bill, describing it as the most draconian ever passed in democratic Zimbabwe. For more on this, we're now joined by Africa analyst Dr William Mpofu. Very good evening to you, Dr Mpofu. Thank you so much for your time. A lot of critics weighing in to this conversation, going as far as describing it as perhaps dangerous because it could potentially close the democratic space ahead of elections. What's your take?
Yeah, it can surprise one that many people are surprised that there is a government in a part of Southern Africa that will pass such a fascist bill that directly seeks to criminalize deliberative democracy. Why one can be surprised that people are surprised is because this is an incumbent government that is a product of a military coup, which was sanitized and which was perfumed as something called a military-assisted transition. When it was a military coup, SADC looked aside, the African Union looked aside, and Zimbabwe's neighbors looked aside as an unconstitutional and military transfer of government was done. So this fascist, authoritarian and totalitarian bill is just one of the ways in which the coup is consolidated. The coup against the people of Zimbabwe is fortified. So it's coup behavior for any government that pretends to advance democracy to pass a bill that bans deliberation, that bans dissent, and that bans questioning of leadership by the multitudes in that country. And the tragedy is not only that the coup government is doing this, is that African multilateral institutions like the SADC and the African Union, and that Zimbabwe's neighbors, that includes South Africa, Zambia, Mozambique, and Botswana, are looking aside when we know full well that Zimbabwe's political and economic problems have become domestic in countries like South Africa, where refugees continue to flock in, where exiles continue to flock in, and where desperate, fearful, and immiserated Zimbabweans continue to flock in as they do in South Africa. So Africa must do something about this reality.
Yeah, and you know, you speak about everyone looking aside and now calls for something to be done. What can be done? Because, you know, a lot has happened in Zimbabwe, it continues to happen, and there seems to be no end to the manner in which the government operates.
Exactly. The impunity with which this government of Mnangagwa conducts itself is exactly as a result of African silence and African negligence in sanctioning African governments and protecting Africans from their governments. There is need, many decades after African countries became independent from colonialism, for African governments to start holding each other to account. We need to stop these formal liberation movements from protecting each other and giving each other brotherly and sisterly solidarity at the expense of ordinary Africans. So we need a robust, decolonial, and forceful Pan-Africanism where African multilateral institutions, African organizations, and African governments can sanction and hold to account other governments in the protection and the interests of ordinary African peoples that continue to suffer under tyranny, political violence, political fraud, and other diabolic practices of robbery governments like the government in Zimbabwe.
What fears do you think this bill raises, especially, you know, elections are just a matter of months away. August is essentially around the corner.
Yes, the fairness, the credibility, and the justice of any election can not only be judged on the outcome, but it can only be judged on the input processes. And so far, the input processes in the Zimbabwean electoral landscape and political landscape have already made the forthcoming election unfree, unfair, and unjust. In that, the media landscape has not been even, tilted against dissenting voices and the political opposition. National resources are not distributed in an equitable manner that empowers and includes opposition political parties and dissenting voices and activists. The practices of fraud and force are already visible, and very Zimbabweans are afraid not only of the violence that is taking place now, but the violence that took place previously. The people are cowed, the people are intimidated, and the people are afraid of the return and the repeat of previous violence that dates back to the Guguraundi genocide in the 1980s and other spectacular episodes of political violence that have taken place where voters have been shot in cold blood in the streets in Harare. So the fears are of fraud, continued violence, and escalation of that government, this weighing down and victimization of the people of Zimbabwe. And this happens as Zimbabwean neighbors, African governments, and African multilateral institutions are not doing anything meaningful to protect Zimbabweans from violent tyranny, despotism, and political fraud, as it were.
The Zimbabwean government has a long history of silencing critics, and a lot of the detail around some of the, outcry around this bill has spoken to the vagueness and the lack of clarity, and also perhaps defining what patriotism essentially means.
The history of yeah, exactly, because there is an attempt by that government to conflate Pan-Africanism to supporting Zanu-PF, to conflate patriotism to supporting Zanu-PF, and to mistake Zanu-PF itself for the country, because genuine Pan-Africanism involves citizens questioning power, speaking truth to power in the interest of the country and in the interest of the nation. But this choreographed, constructed Pan-Africanism that Zanu-PF is advancing is partisanism, where Zimbabweans are being beaten and clobbered to support Zanu-PF against their better judgment, against their wisdom, and against the wisdom of Africa and the human population at world scale. Love for a political party and an individual leader cannot be forced, cannot be legislated, and cannot be pushed down the throats of Zimbabweans, who are now well aware that this government is just another colonial regime, only that it is a native colonial regime that wants to rule, dominate, and monopolize power in the country by force. So there is need for Zimbabweans to lead Africans in standing up against this anachronic, old-fashioned, and primitive political violence that should not be seen anywhere in the world, let alone in any part of Africa in 2023.
Yeah,
that government is behaving like a military junta, and that should not be permitted by
yes.
AU, by
because
SADC.
if you'll allow me, the bill's provisions here, just because it's so vague and imprecise, it makes it prone to abuse by law enforcement.
Yes, the bill itself, in its form and content, is a despicable piece of legislation that should not be found in any page of any constitution in any country in the world. It's literally shutting down the voices of Zimbabweans, scaring away property, and literally telling Zimbabweans to keep quiet and to, by force, support a government that is not of their choosing, that is not of their liking. And I think Africans as a community, we're speaking in Africa Month that has just ended, should oppose this, not under the watch of any African government or any African population, should this be proceeding.
Yeah. Absolutely. Perhaps let's leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for weighing in there. That was Africa analyst Dr. William Mpofu speaking about Zimbabwe's so-called patriotic bill, which outlaws criticism of the government. This, of course, ahead of elections on the 23rd of August.